Do you remember your first ride? You know, the first mode of transportation that gave you a newfound freedom when you were younger? Stick with me for a few minutes while I go back in time and explore some great memories. Hello, I'm your host, Gary Neidert, and you're listening to My First Ride podcast. Today, we're going to go back in time to when the Pontiac Firebird Trans Am was introduced. That was 52 years ago on March 8th. A long time ago. I think you're going to enjoy this story of the beginnings of the Pontiac Firebird. So let's get right into it. Now, there is a website that I go to get some interesting information, and it's 365daysofmotoring.com. And each day it has interesting information that happened in history. And on the 8th, I'm doing this video March 9th. And didn't get a chance to do this yesterday, but for the 8th of March, it was 52 years ago yesterday that the Trans Am was introduced. And so that's what this website was talking about on this day. And I found it very, very interesting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the article on here, and I've also got some information from Wikipedia that I want to read as well, because I found it really fascinating. So let's get into it. The Firebird Trans Am was just one in a series of muscle cars released by Pontiac in the 1960s, including the Grand Prix and the GTO. Now, I had a friend of mine when I was just out of high school. He had a Grand Prix, and I never really considered the Grand Prix a muscle car. It was more of a luxury car. I mean, it had the electric windows, the air conditioning, all that kind of stuff. And it was fast, but I never considered it a muscle car. The GTO, oh yeah, that was the muscle car, the GOAT. But Grand Prix, I don't know about that. But it all began in 1959 when Pontiac hired a young car designer named John DeLorean. You remember the DeLorean, DMC, DeLorean Motor Company, or DeLorean Motor Car, the DeLorean that was used in Back to the Future. That DeLorean, very colorful fella. But he was working for Pontiac and doing all kinds of things that helped out Pontiac. His designs increased sales for Pontiac by 27% between 1962 and 1968. The Grand Prix and the Firebird accounted for half of the gain. That's a lot. On the basis of its muscle cars, Pontiac ruled the youth market of the late 60s and early 70s. The Trans Am, originally a limited model Firebird, would become a symbol in the muscle car niche of automobile manufacturing. The Firebird. Had friends that had a Firebird. A friend of mine's daughter had I think it was the 2002 Firebird, and they bought that brand new for her when she was either about to graduate or graduated. Anyway, but she had that car. Beautiful car, silver. Now, the rest of this I want to talk about from Wikipedia. The Pontiac Firebird is an American automobile that was built and produced by Pontiac from 1967 to 2002 model years. Designed as a pony car to compete with the Ford Mustang, it was introduced on February 23rd of 1967, simultaneous with GM's Chevrolet division platform-sharing Camaro. So here it is. They bring their muscle car to compete with the Mustang. The Mustang that had been brought to the market in 1964 and become all the rage, and now Chevrolet and Firebird, they're having to catch up to it. And this also coincided with the release of the 67 Mercury Cougar, Ford's upscale platform sharing version of the Mustang. However, the Cougar, nice looking car, just didn't have, to me, in my opinion, didn't have the same appeal that the Mustang did. And the Cougar, it eventually turned into a big luxury type car, and it wasn't a performance car. Let's go on here. Now, the name Firebird was also previously used by General Motors as 4 different concept cars. There was the Firebird 1 in 1953, the Firebird 2 in 1956, the Firebird 3 in 1959, and the Firebird 4 in 1964. So here it is, from the 1950s to the early 60s. Firebirds were used in the Trans Am series in the 1960s and 70s. When the Firebird Trans Am was released, there was controversy over the model's inability to compete in the Trans Am because the smallest available engine was too large for use in the series, because the engine was at 400 cubic inches, or 6.6 liters. However, during 1969, a special 303 cubic inch motor, 5.0 liter, was designed for SCCA road racing applications that was not available in production cars. So they kind of got around that. Now, here's some more of the controversy. The name Trans Am also caused controversy because it was used without permission from the SCCA, who threatened a lawsuit against GM. Now, GM settled the dispute by paying $5 to the SCCA for each car they sold. I'm assuming that was the Trans Am that they sold. When the Trans Am was last seen, the model year 2002 Firebirds were in use. From 1966 to 2006, a WS6 Trans Am Coupe provided the body style for the mechanically identical racing cars used in IROC, or International Race of Champions. Now, I remember I used to watch the IROC races, but my memory is that they were Camaros. I never remember seeing any of the Firebirds in there, but that's a long time ago. The first generation Firebird had characteristic Coke bottle styling shared with its cousin, the Chevrolet Camaro. Announcing a Pontiac styling trend, the Firebird's bumpers were integrated into the design of the front end, giving it a more streamlined look than the Camaro. The Firebird's rear slit taillights were inspired by the 66 through 67 Pontiac GTO. Both the two-door hardtop and convertible were offered through the 69 model year. And originally the car was a consolation prize for Pontiac, which had desired to produce a two-seat sports car based on its original Banshee concept car. I didn't look up to see what the Banshee looked like, so I have no idea. However, GM feared this would cut into the Chevrolet Corvette sales and gave Pontiac a piece of the pony car market through sharing the F-body platform with Chevrolet, or the F-body, which would have also been the Camaro. The 67 base Firebird came equipped with the Pontiac 230 cubic inch single overhead cam inline six. Now, based on the standard Chevrolet 230 cubic inch inline six, it was fitted with a single barrel carburetor and rated at 165 horsepower. The Sprint Model 6 came with a 4-barrel carburetor developing 215 horsepower. And of course, most buyers opted for one of the 3 V8s. There was the 326 cubic inch with a 2-barrel carburetor. It made 250 horsepower. There was the 4-barrel HO, or high output 326. It produced 285 horsepower. Or the 325 horsepower 400 cubic inch from the GTO. All 1967 through 68 400 engines had throttle restrictors that blocked the carburetor's second barrels from fully opening. They choked it down. They wouldn't let it run. Was it insurance reasons? What were they afraid of? Who knows what went through the minds of the guys? Maybe one of y'all know and could share that on the comments. A ram air option was also available, providing functional hood scoops, higher flow heads with stronger valve springs, and a hotter camshaft. Power for the ram air package was the same as the conventional 400 HO, or high output, but it peaked at 5,200 RPM. And it goes on. And but that's enough on the motors. I do want to touch on something about the motors after we get through with this part. Let's see here. And they talked about the an HO version of the 350 cubic inch with a revised cam was also offered starting in that year, in 68, I think it was, and which developed 320 horsepower. And the power output of other engines was increased marginally. Marginally. Yeah. So anyway, the Pontiac 350 cubic inch, the 5.7 liter V8, it was actually 355 cubic inch displacement. Well, why didn't they call it a 355? Was it the marketing guys that thought 350 was a little better? I mean, later on there was the 455, both Pontiac and Oldsmobile. That's a pretty good sounding name, 455. 455. Marketing got involved and changed it up. Anyway, the styling differences from 1967 to 1968 was the addition of federally mandated side marker lights for the front of the car. The turn signals were made larger and extended to wrap around the front edges of the car and on the rear. The Pontiac V-shaped arrowhead logo was added to each side. The front door vent windows were replaced with a single pane of glass and astral ventilation. A front air inlet system was added. The 1969 model received a major facelift with a new front end design, but unlike the GTO, it didn't have the Endura bumper. The instrument panel and steering wheel were also revised. The ignition switch was moved from the dashboard to the steering column with the introduction of GM's new locking ignition switch steering wheel. Now, I want to kind of touch on this. So it didn't have that plastic bumper like the GTO did, and I don't know if those are good or bad. I don't know, but it was a little bit different styling. Now, the ignition switch, my first car was a 1964 Volkswagen convertible. It was my little hot rod for the time. 40 horsepower. I mean, how much can you hot rod that? But the styling of it was good. Chrome wheels, all that kind of stuff. But it had the steering column lock in 1964. Well, Volkswagen didn't come standard with the steering column lock until 1968. And just within the last couple of years, I found out that the ignition steering column lock was an option even for 1964. As I've come across Volkswagen convertibles online, I always look to see, does it have the ignition lock on there? Could that potentially have been my Volkswagen that I had all those years ago. I doubt if it is. I hate to think this, but it might possibly have gone to the crusher. But I'd like to think it's still around. Hopefully it is. But anyway, let's get on with the Firebird. In March 69, at $1,083, an optional handling package was offered. It was called the Trans Am Performance and Appearance Package, UPC WS4, named after the Trans Am series. And of course, it started the controversy with SCCA. There were a total of 689 hardtops and 8 convertibles were made. Now, were you a lucky one that got to have one of the 689 hardtop or one of the 8 convertibles that were produced that year of the Trans Ams? If you did, let me know. I'd love to share your story. I'd love to hear about what that was like having one of the Trans Ams, one of the first Trans Am. Now, back when I was in high school and before, I would always get the car magazines, Motor Trend, Carcraft, all those kind of things, Hot Rod. There was an article in Motor Trend that talked about, and I believe it was the Trans Am, and I believe it was the 69. The way the article was written, it made me want that car. And they had pictures of it, and as I remember, it was white with the blue accents. Beautiful, beautiful car. And he talked about how quick it was and all that kind of thing. So I'd love to, I wish I could find that article on Motor Trend. I doubt if they have it online, but it would be interesting to see that article. So anyway, again, if you've had one of these cars, a 69 Trans Am, let me know. I'd like to be able to interview you and talk with you. I'd love to see some pictures. Now, there's something I want to share here about the motors that came on these vehicles. Now, I talked about the 6-cylinder engine that it came with. They bumped it up to 215 horsepower by adding a 4-barrel carburetor to it. Back whenever the smog control issues were going on, the horsepower took a nosedive on all these different Firebirds. I'm looking here in 1977, the base 6-cylinder was 105 horsepower. Now, the L88 403 cubic inch 6.6 liter engine was 185 horsepower. The W72 400 cubic inch was 200 horsepower. The 6-cylinder that was produced in the cars back when they first started production had more horsepower than these 1977s did. Now, get this, in 78, the L80, it went to 100, well, it's still at 185 horsepower. Oh, this is sad. This is sad. And then in 1980, the 5-liter, 150 horsepower. Oh, here we go. The Pontiac Turbo V8 in 1980 as an option, 210 horsepower. So that V6 or that inline 6 from 1967 has as much horsepower as this. Anyway, that's a little bit of information about the Firebirds. I hope you enjoyed that information. I found it fascinating. You know, I thought they're really cool looking cars, and you know, especially Burt Reynolds as Smoking the Bandit made them popular in the, I think it was second generation, and then third generation was like the Knight Rider car and all that kind of thing. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. Again, if you've had a Firebird, a Trans Am, any kind of Firebird, let me know. I'd love to hear the story. So what's coming up next on My First Ride? I'm constantly searching for people that would enjoy telling their stories of their first rides and how their lives were influenced by them. You know, the story behind the story. And I bet you probably know someone that would be a great guest for My First Ride podcast. Maybe that someone's you. Let me know a little bit about your friends that would be willing to share. Let me know a little bit about their story, and the same thing goes for you. Let me know a little bit about your story. So check us out on iTunes, Spotify, and coming up, there'll be a lot more podcast providers that you can find us on. Subscribe to the podcast and listen to the previous episodes of My First Ride podcast. And of course, you can also go to myfirstridepodcast.com. I have one final thought. You may not have your first ride, but you still have the memories. It's time to share them. Contact me if you have any questions regarding today's podcast, or if you'd like to be a guest on My First Ride podcast. I'm Gary Neidert, and you've just experienced My First Ride podcast. Call me 972-771-7899. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching.